All right, so whenever we've read through Hosea, we started out in the first couple chapters. We talked about how he married Gomer, and Gomer came out of prostitution, essentially was a harlot. And even after he married her, she turned around and went right back into her old ways, and he had to redeem her. It cost him everything to redeem her. And he says, this is the picture of God with Israel. And now he's going to give up everything to redeem her. Then we went through all the times where Israel has been very ungrateful. They have the spirit of ingratitude. No matter where they are, no matter how successful they are, they turn around and they stop worshiping God. They start worshiping anything else they can, such as the gods of the land like Balaam, right? Baal was the god, but any god who was like Baal is Balaam, those type of gods. And God says, okay, you're not going to praise me. You're not going to thank me. You're not going to live for me. Well, I will just remove the protection I've put around you. I'll remove the blessings that I've given you. And he's going to remove all of his blessings that the kingdom of Israel, separate from the kingdom of Judah, had. And unfortunately, the kingdom of Judah is soon going to follow in its footsteps. So when evil reigns free, we're going to see what happens to the kingdom of Israel down the road. And we know it from history that the Assyrians conquer the kingdom of Israel and then disperse them everywhere. And in these chapters, we're going to see also, not only does your sin and your rejection and ingratitude to God affect you, but it also affects your descendants, your children, your offspring, right? So let's go ahead and jump into Hosea chapter 9. We'll read the first couple verses. It says, rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people, for thou hast gone a whoring from thy God. Thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. The floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. So Israel had put themselves in a position to worship Baal and ask for fertility from a false god. They went and asked for the fruit of the field to be blessed by Baal. And they would have these parties and these sacrificial parties where they would do this on the threshing floors and on near the vineyards to try to get blessings. But God, so here Hosea tells them that they have no business rejoicing. There's nothing to rejoice for. All of your plentiful harvests, they're going to come to an end. Why? Because it was God who was giving them the increase. It was God who was providing for them with plenteous harvests. But now they've turned away from God. So Hosea tells them, stop rejoicing. All this is going to end. Remember back in Deuteronomy 28, he tells them, if you'll follow me, if you'll obey me, I will give you all the blessings. I'll give you the fruitful land. You'll never go hungry. But if you don't, it's going to stop raining. Your fields are going to stop producing. Bad things are going to happen. So Hosea told him way back in chapter 2 in verse 9, and then again in verse 14, that the grain and the wine were going to be withdrawn. So there's one thing I really think we ought to take from this, and it really applies to us today. A lot of people, a lot of Christians, they confuse prosperity with being in God's will. They confuse the size of the church with the message of the church. That's not one and the same. So from the perspective of the average person, the nation of Israel during this period of time was doing better than the nation of Judah. The people of Israel worshiping their golden calves was doing great. But we see that it was all about to be destroyed just around the corner. So that's still true today. If you were still today, I believe America is the greatest country in the world to live in, to dwell in. We have so much opportunity, so many riches, but don't confuse that with being in God's will. We don't know tomorrow what it'll bring, but we do know that when Christ comes, all nations, including America, will stand against God and his chosen people. So God's not going to allow wickedness to continue forever. So as our brother Leonard reminded us, focus on the word of God. Don't focus on the world around you. Otherwise, you'll be very confused trying to figure out what God has blessed. Then we get to verse 3. It says, they shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim, another name for the kingdom of Israel, shall return to Egypt. They shall eat unclean things in Assyria. What a slap in the face to the people of Israel. Remember what a big deal it was to come out of Egypt. They spent 40 long years seeing that first generation die off on this trip across the desert, across the wilderness into the promised land. Now they're in a land flowing with milk and honey. They have all this stuff. And then God says, hey, you're going to be going back to Egypt, back into bondage. Remember what God's claim to fame was to these people? Back whenever he gave the 10 commandments, he says, I am the Lord thy God, which has brought thee out of the land of Egypt. So he attached the fact that he was their God to the fact he brought them out of Egypt. What does it mean when he says you're going back to Egypt? He's like, I'm no longer your God. You don't want me. You've rejected me. So it's like telling someone in your family, whenever they say, I'm going to disobey, I'm going out anyway. And you say, well, that's fine. Just don't come back. You're no longer mine. I mean, imagine what that would, the gravity of that situation. Heartbreaking. Judgment's coming, and these folks are about to be judged. And it's going to be carried out on Israel by the invasion of the Assyrian Empire, right? And they're going to be exiled and interspersed with all these nations forever. Now, Israel refused. They were given options and options and options, and prophets just kept coming by and saying, listen, return to God. He's desiring for you to return. Even Hosea, you can hear all the heartbreak in God's voice. Like here in a little bit, we'll read where he's just like, do I have to do this to you, Israel? But they refused to acknowledge God as the one who had given them all these blessings. They had rejected God and as such forfeited his blessing. Now they can't claim ignorance. They can't claim that they hadn't heard Hosea's prophecy. Why? Because these are the same prophecies that Moses gave them hundreds of years before. In Deuteronomy 28, it says in verse 58 down through 68, it says, if thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear the glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance and sore sickness, and of long continuance. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also every sickness and every plague, which is not written in the book of this law. Them that will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. And you shall be left few in number. But whereas you were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldst not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught. And you shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. And the Lord shall scatter thee among the people. God's a God of his word. He gave them opportunity after opportunity. He says, I'll scatter you from one end of the earth even to the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. To the people of Israel, did they find rest as they were scattered around the world? Where they were rejected from everywhere they went? But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. Is there a spiritual blindness on Israel? And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God that it were even. And in the even thou shalt say, would God that it were morning. There's no rest day or night. They're constantly going to feel out of place. Why? Because they have not turned to their God. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again, just as Hosea said, with ships. By the way thereof I spoke unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again, and there you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Think about that, how terrifying that is. But praise God, he's still not done with Israel. He still is going to work to bring them back. We'll read more about that. But when these nations, when these Israelites were dispersed, they were forced to eat unclean foods. Why is that a big deal? Do you ever think about that? Why would it matter if a Jew had pork? What would be the big deal? Let's say it's a believing Jew. Let's say Daniel was forced to, eat a piece of pork. What's the problem? It's sin to them, right? Made them unclean. It made them everything that separated them to be God's people were these peculiar behaviors. Everything that separated them, their dress, their outfit, their hairstyles, their diet, their holidays, was unique among the nations. That's what made them. That's their national identity that identified them to God. And in these other nations, that was all going to be stripped from them. We know that Hitler during World War II, what did he do? He used their nationality and their faith to ridicule them. He made them wear what? Remember? Star of David, which you would think would be some kind of, badge of honor. No, this was a badge of hatred. You see, and we talked about a little bit about the racial tensions. This was a worldwide phenomenon, not just a one country phenomenon, right? And all, again, access to the temple would be gone. Everything would be broken. And we as Christians need to be careful in how the world taints us. Whenever we look around us, at the world around us, now again, to the Jew, they can't eat pork. But to me and you, can we indulge in sin? Can we go and say, well, you know what? I know that's dirty, but I'm going to do it anyway. I know that's not true, but I'm going to say it anyway. Get out of a speeding ticket this way, right? The point is, we got to be careful when we're surrounded by trials and temptations not to fall. Daniel was part of a exile, right? But Daniel refused. He said, please give me a chance. Let me trust in God, even in this hopeless situation. I'm going to eat vegetables and be as big as the people eating steak every night, or I guess pork every night, ribs, whatever. But he did, because God was with him. So don't place ourselves as much as we can in situations that will lead us to sin, and pray to God to help us get through those situations. Remember what Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We should be praying the same, because guess what? This world's going to just go more and more and more in a sinful direction. Then we get to verse 4. It says, they shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted, for their soul shall not come into the house of the Lord. So whenever they're in these exiled lands, again, one of the requirements of being a Jew is to make offerings, right? But while they're in exile, there's no offerings to be made. There's no temple to access. They're going to be the same as those who are mourning and are eating. What's the big deal? Why would you be mourning? If you lost a loved one, what's the big deal about that? Because those who were mourning are forbidden access to the temple. Why? If you're near a dead body, what's that mean? Unclean. You're unclean, right? So they're going to live in this semi-permanent situation where they're constantly unclean, right? They are constantly cut off, and they have no access to God. People had taken for granted, just as we take for granted, they had taken for granted their access to God. They had taken for granted their access to meet and assemble themselves together. And they said, oh, well, we'll always have that. And then all of a sudden, they no longer had it. Look at America today. Look at what, because of COVID or whatever other reason, churches couldn't meet. People couldn't worship together. We couldn't praise, couldn't take communion, right? And that's been a reality in many countries long before COVID. It's been a reality around the world for a long time. We took it for granted. And at this point, some people, they're able to go back to church and they don't go. They're not interested in going back. Well, one day you won't have that option. And then you'll realize what it is and what you were missing out. Don't take for granted what God has given you. Ingratitude is what got Israel into that mess, the kingdom of Israel into that mess. We should take heed and be grateful for the fact that we can sit here and have this conversation, that we can sit here in the name of Christ. Go ahead, Ron.
A lot of those mega churches, because they can build such huge ministries, was using the 10 hours of worship as a excuse to blame. In my opinion, we as Christians, we can worship God anywhere, anytime. It's something like one could say, okay, we can't go to church, but at 12 o'clock on Sunday, we'll bow in our homes, we'll pray, we'll study. This is scripture, and so on. I may be wrong.
You're absolutely right.
Paul, when he prayed to write to the Philippians, and they was upset because he was in jail, and he prayed that God would give them a clear discernment of what was going on to make, I'm going to say, a godly decision, a divine decision of how they see them. And I tend to think that everything that is happening, the darker it gets over the time we shine the most. But to me, it appeared that it's the time that we became more victims.
Yeah, we use it as an excuse.
Yeah. And that became our Kool-Aid.
It makes us feel better to say we're victims.
Some of the Christians in the early days, they confused it. They saw this was a time to die for Christ. And they did things for both. Because in those days, they were killed. That's what Paul says, give up our sacrifice, and so on, voluntarily. I think it's a time from now to that. We Christians have to stay before God more and be more discerning of what He is doing to us, in us, and what He will do to us. But we keep identifying with the world. Okay? And this is not our home. And when we identify with the world, and we want to be part of what we have.
We cling tighter.
Yeah.
The more we should be turning to God and just letting all the rest go. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I mean, just for the sake of the video, I'm going to repeat a little bit of that. Just talking about how whenever the opportunities to go to church have gone, well, the church is not a building. The church is the people. And the people can gather in spirit. We can all stay. We're going to pray together about this topic at this time. Or we can meet in the middle of a field. I mean, there was medieval churches and beforehand where they would meet in the catacombs. True believers would meet in the catacombs beneath the building in the cemeteries where no one would bother them. There is nothing that should prevent the people of God from doing the will of God.
That's what I've seen inmates in prison.
The inmates in prison, they meet together in isolated areas.
Whenever there's a lockdown, here comes a situation that prevents service. They always find some kind of a way
To still worship together.
I have preached many times in golf stands. That's my forte. Things like that. I just believe maybe we are losing our connection to the New Testament church.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, and again, I could be wrong, but I believe it's the lukewarmness of the Christian today. I think the lukewarmness of the Christian, if we don't have the structure that we are used to, we immediately say, oh, well, I guess we just can't do it. No, you know what? People have improvised since the creation of the church, and we'll improvise tomorrow.
The world mocked Christ. We can mock today. Oh, the church.
You can have the church. We'll go.
On my knees tonight. Laugh at him.
Right. And like you said, we don't provoke people. Just like Daniel, when he was commanded not to pray, right? But no, go right ahead. Yeah.
It's the devil who is really winning this battle. These are the battles. And we tend to see people. But I think what we can do is let the devil know you are not winning. I'm not talking about people.
Right.
He's going to win this battle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we as Christians, we make God our priority, not the structures we've created as our priority. We make worshiping together our priority, and we make serving God and gratefulness and gratitude to God. Because when you're truly grateful for something, you look for ways to please the giver. All right. If I went and handed somebody $100 just out of the goodness of my heart, Well, can I get you a glass of water? You look for a way to pay me back. Well, God's given us way more than a glass of water. He gave us living water. And how much more should we be desiring to please him? So then we get to verse 5. It says, what will you do in the solemn day and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant places for their silver. Nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacles. So the days of praising God, the days of coming together at the new moons, the days of keeping the feasts of Israel, they're not going to be kept in captivity. When they're spread out across, when they're in exile, they're going to be gathered, these people, by other nations. They're going to be dead and buried. These Israelite people are going to be interspersed, and they will die in exile, and they'll be buried. So all of the great riches that the kingdom of Israel had amassed at this point, some of it relics of the Solomon age, other ones they've amassed at this time, it's all going to be decayed and ruined. And Israel knew this was coming because the Bible made it clear. They sacrificed tomorrow for today. They wanted to do it today. What did Jesus say about your treasures? He said, gather up treasures for here on earth. He said, don't bother. Moth and rust destroy, right? He said, gather up treasures where they matter eternally in heaven, where nothing can destroy them. But again, where do we put our energy? Think about our days. Do we put all of our focus into our spiritual lives and our spiritual work? Our physical needs for most people, most Christians, and I would be, I think, generous in saying this, probably give 90% of their efforts to this life and maybe give 10% of their efforts to the spiritual life. And I think that's being generous for most. It's foolish. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of your life. Do what you have to do to live in this life, but do it all to the glory of God. Doesn't mean quit your job. It means use your job to witness and live for Christ. Use your situation, use your shopping to praise God and to tell people about him. When you go to Kroger's, it's not, Kroger's is a missionary trip. Walmart's a missionary trip. Getting your oil changed, guess what? It's a missionary trip. If it's not, then you wasted your oil change. Then we get to verse 7. It says, the days of visitation are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad for the multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. So don't watch people who get away with things and be jealous of them, right? Oh my gosh, look at how they got away with all that money. Man, that sucks. I wish I was that person. Today, who is it that's mocked in the world? Those who cling to God, those who use Christianity as a crutch, those who believe that history of the Bible. Listen, people of faith being mocked, that's not a new phenomenon. That's happened from back in Israel's time. The prophet's a fool, the spiritual man is mad. They were hated in the kingdom of Israel, and guess what? They're hated today. Did Jesus promise you any less if you serve Christ? No. You will be hated. If you find yourself hated by this world, that's usually a good sign. Usually. Just be hated for the right reasons, right? If you find yourself hated by true believers, be discerning. Sometimes true believers don't know what the Bible teaches. So if you're correcting someone biblically, they may not like it, but be discerning. If you're wrong, change your ways. If you've made a mistake, say, you know what, you're right, brother. You're right, sister. Let's move on. I'm going to change that view. So again, prioritize God in all that we do. We get in verse 8. It says, the watchman of Ephraim was with my God, but the prophet is a snare of a fowler in all his ways, and hatred in the house of God. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore he shall remember their iniquity. He shall visit their sins. So this nation, the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was in severe trouble. Not only were the prophets ignored and the faithful to God ignored, but they became the targets of destruction. Israel was seeking out those who serve God to destroy them. God has extraordinary patience, extraordinary mercy, but it's not eternal. He gave us Jesus Christ. You can choose to accept, but there will come a day where that opportunity ends. I hope that you guys have all accepted. I hope that everyone watching this video will have accepted Jesus Christ before that day comes. But God remembers your sin, your iniquity, unless you've accepted Christ, in which case he separated your sin from you, as far as the east is from the west, eternally far away. But if you've not accepted Christ, he remembers your sin. His judgment is coming. Now, let me ask you a question. Who remembers what the days of Gibeah is? What is Gibeah? Does anybody remember what happened there?
What is what?
Gibeah? Go ahead, tell us.
A priest went into the tribe of Benjamin.
Into Gibeah, yeah.
They went into, this priest went in there and he had his concubine.
Mhm.
And they wanted the priest, and they always wanted the priest sexually. And so he offered the concubine, and they, I guess, murdered. The concubine was laying dead on the slab, and the priest cut her into 12 pieces. Is that each piece to the different tribes?
It's a very good kid's story, bedtime story.
The thing is, the Benjamites, they went after them, but they didn't kill the men. They killed the women and children.
Well, they killed all but 600. They killed all but 600.
They took off, and then they said, well, let them intermarry with their daughters and other tribes.
Yeah,
But they can't know that.
that's correct. I'm just going to repeat the same story just to make sure everybody gets double grossed out, and so I can record it for the video. This one is in, yeah, let's say it's in Judges, where, so the men of this city, whenever this priest comes by with his concubine, they want to have homosexual relations. And they instead send out the concubine, and they literally rape her to death. She's pretty much dead by the morning. And so he goes after she dies, and he cuts her up into 12 parts to show all the tribes the great wickedness the tribe of Benjamin had done. So all the tribes came out with their armies and attacked Benjamin for this great sin, wiping all but 600 of them out. And that was considered one of the most evil events in the history of Israel. But of course, because they would preserve the tribe of Benjamin, they end up giving them some women to marry. And that's a whole other story, which is a very interesting story, but they end up letting them have more children down the road. But the point was, this was one of the most evil times. And look what Hosea is comparing it to the time that was going on in Israel at that moment. So again, what behaviors were so horrid? Think of America today. Okay, I hope we're not quite to this level, but the point is, all sin has become, well, sometimes it's wrong. Well, in certain situations, it's okay. Well, if you're both consenting, it's all right. Well, it doesn't matter if you're married, so long as they don't know. We have watered down sin. And that's just one more step along the way towards total depravity, where we just keep on desensitizing ourselves to sin. And then you wake up one morning and you can't go outside because your life is at risk by just existing. So we see that on God's report card, don't look at the world around you, look at the word of God. Israel looked pretty good to the world around him. But unfortunately, in God's view, he looked like they did back at Gibeon, that terrible, terrible time. And Hosea will refer to this again in a few chapters. So then we get to verse 10. It says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree for the first time. Those are positive allusions there. But they went to Baal Peor. They separated themselves unto that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. So think about what that contrast is. When you're going through the desert, you want to come to an oasis. And oh my gosh, how awesome would it be to find some grapes ready to eat on the cluster, right? Just sitting there in the vine. That's how they were. They were fresh fruit in the middle of the desert. They were refreshing, a people devoted to God. But when they arrived to Baal Peor, they began to have all these adulterous and promiscuous relationships. Does anybody remember what happened there? What happened to Baal Peor? What? Balaam. Yes. What happened with Balaam? Fill us in. What did he do?
He tried to curse. He wanted God to curse Israel. God wouldn't, so he brought in sexual morality.
Correct. You had the Midianite women go out and cause the children of Israel to engage in promiscuity and fornication. The next thing you know, many of them died because of a plague. So this is how Israel responded when coming in. I mean, they came in as the people of God conquering, and then they went after this adulterous, after this false faith that leads them into sin. That's the same thing they did then. That's the same thing that this kingdom was doing now. So this is the sadness. And God, again, he's not having a good time in judging the kingdom of Israel. He is heartbroken. So then we get to verse 11. It says, as for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird from the birth and from the womb and from the conception. Who can tell me what the name Ephraim means? Fruitfulness, right? So here we have fruitfulness. Why is the kingdom of Israel called Ephraim? Why is that the synonym to kingdom of Israel? Because they were far and away the most fruitful tribe. They made up the majority, even though they're one tribe, they made up a big, significant portion of the population. So the term Ephraim became synonymous. But it's going to fly away. Not only are the adults going to suffer, but the children are going to suffer. The unborn are going to suffer, even all the way back to conception. They're going to lose children. So if you have ever, again, infertility was going to plague these people. If you ever met somebody who's desperate to have a child and cannot, you'll understand the pain that can cause, the pain that can cause and the desires you have. But it's quite a mercy whenever you think about what world or what faith these children would grow up in. If you look at the situation of the kingdom of Israel, a child growing up there would have really be in a lot of trouble. So in some ways, it's merciful. Some people, and again, I'm not saying ever, I would never say abortion's a good thing. But I believe, and I believe the Bible, you can support this idea that the children who die, both in the womb and as young children, will be with the Lord. I think they are with the Lord. So in a sense, I'm pleased to hear they went to heaven. But of course, it's a tragedy to see these children never get to live life. But again, so when I look around today, again, going back and forth to today to back then, when I look at today, I look around at this world and where things are heading, and I fear for the world my kids are going to grow up in, for the world they are growing up in. It seems like as soon as you step out of your house, the ways of Satan, the influences of Satan are trying to come in all around you. And sometimes you don't even have to step out of your house for it. You turn on the TV show, you watch a movie. There's all these different influences. The internet, you name it, the devil wants in. He wants in desperately. And you have to be vigilant or he will get in. You read in verse 12 and 13, it says, though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them, that there shall not be a man left. Yea, woe also to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I saw Tyrus, is planted in a pleasant place, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to the murderer. So Tyre was a very powerful city at one point. It was a very big center of commerce at one point. And the kingdom of Israel wanted to be like Tyre. They modeled themselves after it. It's all about self-service, self-enrichment. But they stopped serving God. Do you know that still today, the main goal of most people is self-enrichment, prosperity, work hard to get ahead, focus so that you can make money and enjoy all the things in life? What is the goal and aspiration of every kid? What do we tell them? Make something of yourself. Well, what does the Bible say? You are someone because of Jesus, not because of what you make of yourself. Go out and do something for him. What is Jesus's opinion of material success? How close does that make? How close does material success make you to the kingdom of heaven? Not very. Now, does that mean material success is a sin? Of course not. Does that mean you can't make money? Of course not. But what that means is that's not what makes a spiritual person. That's not what blesses you in life. I have seen much happier people living in poverty than many of the richest people in the world, because true happiness comes from Jesus Christ and knowing him as your personal savior. So don't focus on material success, social popularity, power, and all these things. That's what they focused on then, and look where it got them. That's what people focus on today, and look where it's getting them. Then we read verse 14 and 15. It says, give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Think about what he's praying for. All their wickedness is in Gilgal, for there I hated them. For the wickedness of their doings will I drive them out of mine house. I will love them no more. And all their princes are revolters. So things had gotten so bad that you'd be better off not to have kids back in ancient Israel. Is there a time in the future where that is actually advised? Woe unto you who give suck. Woe unto you who are expecting. You remember who said that?
At the end times.
It's the end times, but who stated that? Who stated woe unto you who are with child? Jesus Christ, right? Because you'd be better off not having kids at that horrible time, right? This nation had done everything wrong. They had driven out, whenever they came into the promised land, they had driven out all the enemies of God, all these people who rejected God. 400 years, their sin was full. They had rejected him. And what did they do when they got in there? They started worshiping the same gods that got the previous people into a big mess. This was a sad, sad state of affairs. But, again, don't think we're above this. You'll see some folks say, you know what, that church doesn't do things biblically. I'm going to leave that church because I want to do things biblically. Then the next thing you know, whatever they put together has also drifted from the Bible. They focus so much on not doing it like those guys that they start doing it like these guys, but they're still not doing it like the Bible says, like God has asked for. We need to focus, again, as I've said over and over, on the Word of God and on Jesus Christ. Then we get to verse 16 and 17. This is the end of the first chapter 9. It says, Ephraim is smitten, their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth, yet will I slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. My God will cast them away, because thou did not hearken unto him, and thou shalt be wanderers among the nations. So the nation known for its fruitfulness rejected God. They became strangers, and they'll wander through the earth. It is a sad, sad state of affairs. But 10 verse 1 continues on. It says, Israel is an empty vine. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself. According to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased the altars. According to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. So think about that. He says, you were so fruitful, but all your fruitfulness made a bunch of false idols. You began to worship false altars. Isaiah, who lived about the same time, we think, as Hosea, based on the historians, he calls Israel the vineyard of God. He talks about the people of Judah being the vines, but instead of doing good, what did they do? They did evil. They were broken down. And he says that God planted them, but because they chose to do evil instead of good, they were not fruitful. Do you remember what Jesus says whenever he's going on his way to the temple? He's on his way to this temple, the synagogue, and what happens? He sees a fig tree. He's like, oh, okay, let me go check out what's on the fig tree. Remember what he finds? No fruit. What's he do? He curses it, right? But there's a promise that, wow, you think that can't come back? It can come back. And he later gives a prophecy about how this fig tree will return, how the fig tree will bear fruit. When it puts out its leaves, you'll know the time is nigh, right? So it was withered away. So the more prosperous we are as humans, we tend to serve God less. The more we can depend on ourselves, the less we depend on God. It's easier for a camel to enter into the eye of a needle than for a man who trusts in riches to be saved, to enter the kingdom of God. So even if you have riches, do not trust in them. That could end tomorrow. The economy could collapse tomorrow. All your retirement could be gone tomorrow. But you know what? Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that's the only thing we ought to be trusting in. Verse 2 says, their heart is divided. Now shall they be found faulty. He shall break down their altars. He shall spoil their images. So again, this kingdom, remember we talked about earlier, it was half baked. It was lukewarm, half for God and half for the world. Well, what does Jesus say? If you're not against me, you're for me. If you're not for me, you're against me, right? God's not interested in the lukewarm. Elijah, remember whenever he set up the ultimatum? He says, if you're for God, fine, stop being of two minds. Either be for God or be for Baal. Pick one. Doesn't matter which, just pick one. And what is James chapter 1, verse 8? Does anyone know the verse offhand? Double-minded man? Unstable in all his ways. I think it was James 1:8. I don't know if I said that. So while God had let Israel get away without judgment, without severe judgment for 200 years, a delay in judgment doesn't indicate a deferment. No, it's going to happen. It's not going to be an end of judgment. It's actually coming in the future. I hope, I pray that America will heed the warning given to Israel, that they'll see that they need to turn back to Christ. I don't have high hopes, but I certainly do pray for it to happen. Then we see in verse 3, for now they shall say, we have no king, because we feared not the Lord. What should a king do to us? So we have elected leaders in this country, right? And they're supposed to represent our morals and our beliefs. We took our courthouses, remember our courthouses back when they were all built? What did we do? We put the 10 commandments on there because of truth and justice and the right way to live. Our schools started every day with what? A prayer. There was a pledge of allegiance because our nation is under God. We took all of our money. What did we label it with? In God we trust, right? What about today? Well, look at all the things that began to erode from our society, from our nation. We don't elect leaders who are morally treating us. No, we elect leaders who benefit us for the next moment. And whenever we want to challenge the election results, right? We want to challenge it. Why? If the election had been flipped and your guy had won, would you still want to challenge the results because you still thought fraud was going on? Or do you just want to make sure that it goes your way? We all want to see what benefits me today, right? We took all of the 10 commandments out of schools, out of courthouses. We removed prayer from the school. We silenced prayer, but we're okay with cursing. If you want to use God's name in vain, that's okay. Just don't say in his name we pray. That's where it's wrong. No kidding. People have lost their jobs. But if they say GD or something like that, then it's perfectly acceptable, right? So the last person our nation trusts, even though it's just kind of barely hanging on our money, the last person we trust in is who? God. So we're following the same path that Israel's following. For now shall they say, we have no king because we feared not the Lord. Who is our leader? Who does America say this is our leader? A few years ago, it was Trump. Now it's Biden. These are our leaders. This is the best we come up with. How about our leader is Jesus Christ? And whoever he puts over us, fine. But we're still going to model our lives to be like Christ. Verse 4 says, they have spoken words, swearing falsely and making a covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as a hemlock in the furrows of the field. So imagine people that are not true to their word. So imagine a marriage. Imagine if somebody said, yes, we're going to get married. We're going to get married, but we're not going to be faithful to any of the vows. Why? Did you ever wonder, why do people still take marriage vows? Like, what's the point of it? I mean, imagine right now if I say I'm going to take care of you in sickness and in health. But as soon as you get sick, we've had a lot of people get in the medical field. We see it a lot of times. People will get a very bad illness and their spouse will up and leave. Yeah, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm too busy for that. They'll up and leave. What if your word means nothing? So imagine, let's go a little bit more broad and say, what if I said, hey, oh, you're getting together Saturday? I'll be there. And then I don't show up. And then I call you like, oh yeah, sorry, something came up. Does your word mean nothing? Do you know your value to someone else? Do you know it hurts them when you tell them that they're important enough for you to be there, but then you're not because, well, something came up. I'm not saying things don't come up, but show them you care enough. By today, we all have these, except for Shane. Everybody's got cell phones, right? Pick up the phone and give them a call. Leave a message, send a text, right? There's no excuse for that. Be true to your word. A man's word and a woman's word used to mean something. When I say you have my word, it means something. It means so much more to the Christian because I don't have to say you have my word. I should never have to say I promise. No, your yea should mean yea. Your nay should mean nay. Period. Right? A covenant is something you should rely on. So Israel made alliances with Assyria, and then they broke them and joined Egypt, right? They swore falsely in making a covenant. And what did that mean to Egypt and to Assyria? That means that Israel's word meant nothing. So ultimately they were destroyed. But praise God. Praise God. There is one man whose word will never be broken. He said that he would save us. He made a covenant with us. And his covenant was salvation through his own blood. He said, by grace you are saved through faith. not of yourselves, lest any man should boast. Not of works, lest any man should boast. Praise God, he made a covenant with us that we did nothing to deserve except accepting it. So that redemption he was given, they gave the rules for all men to fulfill. So he fulfilled his own covenant from his side. And his word is true, and we ought to reflect that to the world and be true in our words and in our behavior. And we'll see in verse 5 and 6 now how Israel wasn't true, and they end up turning and failing because they worshipped golden calves instead of the true God. So verse 5 says, the inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the calves of Bethaven. For the people thereof shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof that rejoiced on it, for the glory thereof, because it is departed from it. And it shall be also carried unto Assyria for a present to King Jareb. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. So this is pretty pathetic. The people who saw the entire world crumbling and the judgment of God upon them, what are they worried about? These golden calves that they had worshipped. That was their main focus. These golden calves, that's Samaria and Bethel. And what are they mourning for? They're mourning for what they lost. There is a big difference. I mentioned this in the last time. There's a big difference between mourning and repentance. There's godly sorrow, and then there's being upset that you got in trouble. They're upset to see all their riches go away, but they have not repented. They're not turning back to God. So King Jareb means, or King Jareb, Melech Jareb, means the king, the great king. So specifically, he's referring to the king of Assyria, right? And Israel brought shame on who? Did they bring shame on themselves? Sure. But who did Israel really shame? Who did it dishonor when Israel fell to the king of Assyria? God, right? Remember whenever God said to Moses, let me just destroy them, I'll make of you a great nation. He says, what will the Egyptians say? Don't let them ever say anything bad about you because you've put your name on this people. Christians, do we bring shame to the name of Christ? If you're going to go out there and say, I am a Christian, who are you representing? Who are you living for? Be very careful what hill you choose to die on. Said that 1 billion times. We die for serving Christ. That's a line we live by. We don't care whether you think this conspiracy theory is true. That's fine. You want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. But that's not a hill to die on. We like to see the politicians we like in power, but that's not a hill to die on. The hill to die on is what Jesus says. Go out to all nations, preaching the good news, converting, making disciples, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Serve Christ. Don't mourn over what was lost. We get in verse 7 and 8. It says, as for Samaria, her king is cut off as the foam upon the water. The high places also of Avon, the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. This is what the same thing the people in Revelation say when God's judgment comes down, right? Their king will be destroyed. Guess what? The king in Revelation will also be destroyed, the Antichrist. The thorn and the thistle, what's that a sign of? The curse. The curse of sin is going to come on the promised land. It's going to overgrow all these wicked sites of worship. These people, this kingdom, they planted sin. Guess what they're going to reap? The wages of sin. What are the wages of sin? Death. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Verse 9 and 10 says, O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah. Here's the other reference we talked about. There they stood. The battle of Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. It means it wasn't shut down. It was actually increased. It is my desire that I should chastise them, and the people shall be gathered against them when they shall bind themselves in their two furrows. So ever since that great wickedness from the tribe of Benjamin, Israel continued to fall into sin. God's desire was to punish them, to correct them. When I chastise my child, it's not to imprison him, it's to correct him, get him right back on the right path. But they refused. So he's going to use the Assyrians to bring judgment against Israel. Israel was busy going from one trench to another, a furrow, right? Whenever you take a oxen and you want it to plow the land, you want to go straight line, straight line, straight line. You don't want to go zigzag and go from one line to the other. But this is the problem with the stubborn ox. The stubborn ox, I'm following God, Baal. No, I'll go back to Baal or one of the false gods. They could not keep the straight path. And of course, what's going to happen? Because of their wickedness, they're going to need discipline. They're going to need punishment from God. We get to verse 11. It says, and Ephraim is a heifer that is taught and loveth to tread out the corn. But I passed over upon her fair neck, and I will make Ephraim to ride. Judah shall plow, and Jacob shall break his clods. So cows, if you think about the oxen back in the Old Testament, what do you think their favorite job was? They didn't like carrying burdens. They didn't like being ridden. What they loved was threshing out the corn. Does anybody remember why they would love threshing out the wheat and the grain and the corn? Because they weren't muzzled. Very good. They got to eat as much as they wanted. It was like a buffet. So this is the best job ever. So God had blessed Israel with abundance. He says you can have it all. God says you're free to eat when you work. That's in Deuteronomy 25:4. You can't muzzle the ox that's treading the corn. But Israel kept taking advantage of God's provision and not showing gratitude, not responding to his great blessing. They loved the gift more than the giver, a sin we are all guilty of. So rather than doing the threshing, they had to go to more burdensome work of plowing the field, from breaking up the ground. God struck the neck of Ephraim and Judah, just as you would a cow that's not being obedient. You'd have to get out the correcting rod, right? But through their difficult work, through the difficulties of these nations over millennia now, right? Their hard work would break up the clods of earth that covered their heart. Their hearts would eventually be softened. You read in verse 12 and 13, it says, sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground. For it is time to seek the Lord till he come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed wickedness, you have reaped iniquity, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because thou didst trust in thy way, in the multitude of thy mighty men. When ground is set too long, has anyone here ever tried to break up ground with a shovel? Not with some big machinery? It's not easy. The longer the ground sits there, it's a lot of work, right? So it becomes very hard to work. The longer it sits, the harder it becomes, right? But that doesn't change the fact that it can be broken up. It does take a lot of work, but it can be broken up. Our hearts, when we've hardened them, they can be broken. Let's just say our hearts have turned to stone because of the hardness and stubbornness of our ways. What does the Bible say about the heart of stone? It says, I will take out that stony heart that's in you, and I will put in you a heart of flesh. He can give you a real heart transplant, right? So when you get in a rut, when you're not going to church, when you're not praying, when you're not reading your Bibles, it's actually harder to convince yourself to get back into it. How do you convince yourself to get back into it? You just get back into it. You got to start and say, you know what? Haven't been, I'm going. And you get up and you go. Whenever you haven't witnessed in months or years, oh man, I'm nervous. Oh, I don't have a speak. Guess what you do? You get up and you witness. And guess what? You're going to look like a fool. But that's okay. You're not doing it for you. You're doing it to look good. You're doing it for God, right? The more you do it, the more you can do it. So again, what's the best way to keep doing a good work? Is to start in a good work and don't let it up. Don't let go. So these folks in ancient Israel, they trusted in their own strength and their own mighty men and their own gods. And of course, look where it took them. But think about all of these chapters have just been condemnation after condemnation. But you see God's great mercy, even in the midst of the condemnation, even in the midst of the judgment. He pleads with them, break up your fallow ground. Seek the Lord. He's ready. He was ready then. He's ready now to pour out his righteousness upon you. Not any righteousness of your own, but his righteousness, he will pour it upon you. If you just turn back to him, seek his face. The book of Malachi, written to Israel, was talking about, bring in the tithes, bring in the storehouses, serve God, honor God. See if he doesn't open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so many blessings you can't even receive it. Yes, that was a promise to Israel, but do you think that God would treat his children any different? And I am a child of God because of Jesus Christ. And so are you. Don't harden your heart and don't turn away. You see in verse 14, it says, therefore, because they refused to soften their hearts, it says, therefore shall a tumult arise among the people. All thy fortresses shall be spoiled, as Shalman spoiled Beth Arbel in the day of battle. The mother was dashed in pieces upon her children. So Israel refused to repent, and there was going to be a lot of uprising among the people, and all of their strength would be broken. Hosea, he's referring to some historical event, which we don't have a lot of details on, but most people, most historians think it's where the king of Assyria and King Shalman, he actually conquered a city in this place called the Ambush of God. Most, again, they think this king was Shalmaneser III, but the practice during that day was a very wicked practice, very brutal practice, where when they conquered a city, they would cast the kids off a cliff and make the moms watch. And then when they had seen it, they would throw the moms too. You think of the brutality of all this, right? You can see those references in 2 Kings 8:12, Isaiah 13, verse 16, and Psalm 137, 8 and 9. It's tragic, but God wanted to protect them from all this. God wanted to prevent all of this, but they refused. So verse 15 says, so shall Bethel do unto you because of your great wickedness. In a morning shall the king of Israel utterly be cut off. So just like the city had been destroyed, the kingdom of Israel and the centuries of worship that they were following would be destroyed. And their king would be cut off, and there would never be again a king in Israel. Now, praise God, the king of Judah, that line would never be broken. He would continue, and there would still be a line all the way to a little tiny stable or manger in Bethlehem, right? And that's where, of course, the eternal king showed up. So Assyria was an instrument of God's wrath. God's wrath is shown in many ways. But we look around at the world today, look around you right now, and look at the nations. The foundations of the nations are crumbling. The foundations in Europe are crumbling. They've already crumbled in many places. They're crumbling in America. Don't think that any of this is all happening by chance. The purpose of all these prophecies that Hosea was telling them was not to tell Israel, you have no hope. He was saying, listen, you brought this on yourself. Repent and seek God. God is merciful. He was merciful then. He's merciful today. He doesn't want to see the vilest of sinners go to hell. He does not want to see anyone go to hell. The person who murders people, he would still like to see them repent and be saved. Yes, there are consequences to their sin, but he wants to see people saved. He prefers to save you. He doesn't want to condemn you. He doesn't want to send you to hell. Hell was not designed for you. It was designed for Satan and his fallen angels. He did everything he could to prevent that. And he reaches out his hands. He says, besides all this, his hands are outstretched still. But one day that door closes. I hope nobody here waits till it's too late. That brings us to the end of chapter 10. Should we get into chapter 11? We got time? We got, what, 20 minutes? Yeah, let's try. We'll try to get through it. That'll give us one more session next time, and we'll finish Hosea hopefully next time. So Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. You guys all still awake? Is everybody awake? Raise your hand if you're asleep. All right, well, we'll say, hey, take care. We're going to see this. Thanks for coming out. Okay, so Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So in Jeremiah 31, verse 9, Israel is referred to as a child of God, as an individual. But we know Israel was actually a nation. So, and whenever you read in the book of Isaiah, he switches all the time between a nation and an individual, a nation and an individual. Well, what do you think that was? So when we think about Israel as a nation, when they were young as a nation, only 400 years old, they were in Egypt, right? Because they went down as a family, they came out as a nation. So when they were young, God indeed called them out. But what about this verse? Where is this verse mentioned again? Anybody remember? When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Matthew, exactly. Who's it referring to? Jesus Christ. Because what's the whole volume of the book? Who's it written about? Jesus Christ. So whenever we read in the Old Testament, you're going to find these prophets unknowingly to them. The Bible says, they desired to look into these things. They're going to be prophesying not just about the nation, but actually about the Messiah of the nation. So when Israel, but this reference had a double fulfillment. One was historical, one was prophetic. The previous fulfillment was Israel being called out of Egypt. The future is when the Messiah was going to be called out of Egypt when his family went there to flee from Herod. So then, and again, we could read Matthew 2:13-15 if you want to read it. But we know throughout the Old Testament, God calls himself the father of the nation. But it's pretty incredible to see he's the father of an individual. He's the father of Jesus Christ. What's more incredible and beyond my understanding is that how the child of God, the Son of God, could come to this earth, could live the perfect life, die for my sins. And if I accept him, which praise God, he saved me, then I would be happy to be a servant of his for eternity. But he says, no, I'm going to adopt you as a son. My son took your place. Now you can become my child. I don't get that. I believe it. Praise God for it, but I don't get that. I don't understand how we should ever deserve such a blessed situation to be the adopted children of God. That's incredible. And he thinks of you as a child because you've accepted him. That's unfathomable to me. Go ahead, Ginger. And you're an heir, a fellow heir with Christ. It's incredible. And for what? What did you do to deserve that again? Nada. Verse 2 says, as they called them, so this is chapter 11. I don't know if I mentioned that. Hosea 11, verse 2 says, as they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Balaam and burned incense to graven images. So Israel's been called out of Egypt. And instead of responding to God's love by saying, we're going to serve you, well, we're going to be like the prodigal son. What did the prodigal son do? Wow, I'm your son. I get all these blessings. I get all this stuff. But what's I'm going to go spend it on worldly things. I'm going to devote my life to everything but you. And when the world called them, they followed the call of the world. Verse 3 and 4 says, I taught Ephraim also to go, taking them by their arms, but they knew not that I healed them. I drew them with the cords of a man, with bands of love. And I was to them as they that take off the yoke on their jaws. And I laid meat unto them. God provided for Israel in every way. He treated them with blessings despite their misdeeds. He removed burdens out of their way. He removed their enemies out of their way. But Hosea, imagine how heartbreaking that despite all the efforts that God had done, Israel rejected him at this time. Now think about the guy who's writing this. Imagine loving Gomer, Hosea. This is very personal to him. He loved Gomer. He spent everything for her. But what did she do? She went right back to worship, to going to her, the people who had purchased her, that she was a harlot with, right? So again, it's a complete and utter rejection of love. It is a heartbreaking situation. Verse 5 says, he shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refused to return. And the sword shall abide on his cities, and shall consume his branches and devour them, because of their own counsels. So if Israel had thought the time in Egypt was bad, the time in Assyria is going to be much worse. Because is this going to be a bad time? They're not even going to let them keep their identity. In Egypt, the Jews could still be Jews. Here, they're not even going to let them act as Jews. It was all going to go away. We see many of these people joining to a new group called the Samaritans, right? Because they were focused out of Samaria, and they would be hated by the Jews. So again, all this is going away. The cities of Israel would be under occupation and ultimate destruction by the Assyrians. Then verse 7 and 8 says, and my people are bent to backsliding from me. Though they had called them to the Most High, none at all would exalt him. Listen to the heartbreak in this passage. Verse 8 says, how shall I give thee up, Ephraim? How shall I deliver thee, Israel? How shall I make thee as Admah? How shall I set thee as Zeboim? Mine heart is turned within me. My repentings are kindled together. You hear the pain in God's voice? He's saying, how am I going to judge you? He's heartbroken for what he has to do to Israel, because he has to keep his word that he told them back in the Exodus whenever Moses was speaking. He wants to save them. He wants to redeem them. It burns him up. And we see the fact that God's desire, some people will argue it's God's will that some go to hell. God's great desire was to see Israel saved. He knew they would not, but his desire, his will was to see them saved. Now he says, look at Admah and Zeboim as the model of what's going to happen to you. Who can tell me? I asked a couple people earlier. Who can tell me what happened to Admah and Zeboim? Does anybody remember? Everyone? I don't want everyone to answer at once. These are lesser known cities, right? Genesis 10:19 tells you the city. It says, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim and unto Lasha. These were 5 cities of the plain, right? Do you remember what happened to these 5 cities of the plain? Well, they joined in a great battle. 5 kings, verse 4. Remember back when Sodom and Gomorrah, they made a confederacy with 5 kings to overthrow their ruler? Well, they were one of those 5 cities. And then we also know they shared the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew the cities of the plain, as recorded in Genesis 19 and verse 25 mentions it. So what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? What was their sin? Pride. Homosexuality. Okay, pride. How about anyone else? How about the acceptance of sin?
Wanting to mate with angels.
Yes, yes. Wanting to have relations with angels? Absolutely. So we know that while the angels were there, they were looking for sodomy, both as with angels and with the same-sex angels. But not only that, we know from later in the Bible, I can't remember if it was Isaiah or where it mentions it, it says their sin is pride. The sin of Sodom was pride. And the main thing beyond all that was the public acceptance of sin. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people doing this. The whole city was there, and they were cheering on the desire to sin. Israel was following the same pattern. They were sinning, and there was a lack of repentance. It's heartbreaking for the father to see this son, even if they have to pay for their crimes. It was heartbreaking for God. And he's going to have to judge them because he is a fair and just God. Remember what Jesus says, hey, if the people in this such and such a city should have seen what you saw, they would have repented a long time ago. And the people in this city, they would have repented a long time ago. He's going to be a just judge. Verse 9 says, I will not execute the fierceness of mine anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man. So he's going to judge them, but he's going to have some mercy mixed in. He says, because I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of thee, and I will not enter into the city. So this tells you that your God is a personally involved God. He does not just create something and then impersonally turn away because humans are meaningless. If you ever look at the size of the planet Earth and the size of the planet Earth in the universe, you'll be like, what is man that you're mindful of him? Right? You're gonna be like, what are we? What does one person's life matter? But to God, every life matters. Every single person is infinitely valuable. Why? Why are we valuable? Because we are created in God's image. Thank you, Wayne. Everybody's infinitely valuable. And he wants to show us mercy. He gives us mercy when we don't deserve it. He doesn't leave us to die in our sins, even though that's what we deserve. He could destroy us entirely, just as he did during the flood. But no, he says, any who will accept my son, I will pay. He's going to adopt us as his children. And we've done nothing to deserve it. It's a greater love than we can ever understand. One day, the remnant of Israel will turn to him. Today, Gentiles and some Jews are turning to him. That's the church. And we have something great to look forward to, which we are all going to be there for. If you've accepted him, you'll be there for this day, following him. Verse 10 and 11, again, a prophecy about the end times. So once he will not destroy them, he's going to repair them or redeem them. We see in verse 10 what will happen. He says, they shall walk after the Lord. He shall roar like a lion. And believe me, that day is coming, and his roar will be powerful. When he shall roar, then the children shall tremble from the west. Then they shall tremble as a bird out of Egypt, and as a dove out of the land of Assyria, and I will place them in their houses, saith the Lord. Here we see the hope of Israel and the hope of all mankind, that Jesus Christ is going to come back. He's not one and done. He came as a lamb, but he's not just a lamb. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is coming back. And when he does come back, at the end of the tribulation, his people come out of hiding. Once the sin has been paid for and they have accepted that payment, which he's already paid for it on the cross, when the people of Israel join the church in accepting Jesus as the king, we're going to flock to the lion who's roared to collect his pride, to bring the pride back together. But notice, one thing about verse 10, which I think is kind of cool. The Assyria was where relative to Israel? It was to the east, right? The northeast. But he says that they're going to come trembling from the west. He does mention Egypt, but that was a minority of Israelites that went there. But the vast majority of Israel will return from where? Where's the majority of Jews that were dispersed around the world? They were in Europe and America. And that's where most of them went back from, right? So he's talking about the end return of all the people. And we know under the Antichrist, many Jews will suffer and die from the rule of that wicked king. But we know many of them will go into hiding until Jesus returns. Then our final verse for the evening says in verse 12, now I think the Hebrew Bible, by the way, it actually ends in verse 11, but we'll go ahead and finish with verse 12. So the end of the chapter is verse 11. So verse 12 says, Ephraim compasseth me about with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah yet ruleth with God, and is faithful with the saints. So this chapter showed God as this loving father, and Israel is this rebellious son, but God's heartbreak at judgment. He's angry, but he is heartbroken. He wants to punish them, to chastise them, but his heart remains burning. Man, today's not a good day for cups. But his heart's burning. But you will see one day the light of Israel is maintained through Judah. And who is the light of Israel that will be maintained? Jesus. So it's not that Judah, the nation, is going to be faithful. It's that Judah, the man, the final Judah, the man who comes from the tribe of Judah, is going to remain the light. And that light is none other than Jesus Christ. All right. Well, we'll stop there. I'll open it up to any questions or statements.